I love saying my mother's name out loud. Lucille Ellen Elliott Ike. She called me her favorite daughter. Then again, I was her only daughter. But I'll return the compliment. She was my favorite mother. She died a long time ago, in 1987. Several years after that, I realized suddenly that when I was remembering what she looked like, it was actually different photographs that I was remembering. It seemed as if I couldn't remember what she had looked like through my own eyes. And she was traveling even farther away from me than she had, and I didn't think that could have been possible. So I was really upset. But then I remembered her hands, and there are no photographs of them. Her hands were thin. There wasn't much meat on the bones. You could in fact see the bones and veins through the backs of the skin of her hands. Her fingers were long and long and slender. She would file her fingernails into graceful ovals, just extending, maybe a quarter of an inch beyond her fingertips. She occasionally wore nail polish, but she always wore her platinum wedding band. And as long as she wasn't doing anything messy, she wore the matching engagement ring, which had a round, brilliant cut diamond. The more I thought about her hands, the more I remembered. I remember her hands when she was playing the piano, either by herself or when we were playing duets. Her favorite song was from the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical Carousel, the song "You'll Never Walk Alone." That musical came out during World War II, when my parents were separated for 2.5 years. And I think that song was special to her. It helped her get through the times my father was away in the U.S. Army. He was in the fighting for just 9 months. But even one day is a long time for a loved one to be in fighting. I remember the first time we got a piano book that had that song in it. It was a children's book because my brother and I were taking piano lessons. She bought it for us. She sat down and played it because it was her favorite song. But then she said, "That's not right. The arrangement shouldn't be chords in the left hand. That makes it sound like a hymn. It should be flowing." And then she did something that I will never forget, because I was strictly forbidden to do what she did. She wrote in that book. Oh. And she didn't just use a pencil, no. She used one of those new Bic ballpoint pens. This was circa late 1950s. And she changed those chords. She spread them out so that they were proper musical notation, so she could play it. And she was very satisfied with what she had done. Several years later, my father bought her the Rodgers and Hammerstein songbook. And of course, the first song she played from that was "You'll Never Walk Alone." She approved of that arrangement. I remember my mother's hands when she went like this. Now, I know she's not the only person who went like this, but she did this when she had to catch your attention, when she had something special to say. I remember her doing that a lot when I was first married. You see, my husband and I lived in Boston. We would come down and visit my parents in southern Connecticut about once a month, once every 2 months. And we would park our car in the driveway just beyond the house. Now, my mother believed that there was only one place you could park a car in the driveway where it wasn't in the way of everyone else getting to the garage in the back of the property. And my husband took a long time to find that invisible parking space. I can remember many times he would park the car, I'd get out of the car and see my mother in the kitchen window, the one that overlooked the driveway, and she had her finger up. And once she got my attention, she would either go like that, move away from the house, or come closer. And I tell my husband, you've got to start the car again and move it. Finally, since everybody was parking in that spot, the driveway kind of sunk a little bit, so my husband could just kind of slide the car into that spot. Now, when we were leaving, I would look to wave one last time as I was getting in the car, and she would have her finger up, and she would hustle out and tuck $2 in my pocket and say, I'd like you to call me when you get back so that I know you got back safely. And I would invariably say, all right, Mother. You see, I didn't realize how parents worried about children until my son was born. But most of all, I remember my mother's hands when she was knitting. She usually had 2 projects going at a time. And she made countless sweaters, hats, scarves, mittens, vests for my father, my brother, and me. She also made things for our extended family. For example, when each of my cousins were graduating from high school, they would make a trip to Cedarbaum's yarn shop in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where my mother had bought yarn for decades. And together they would pick out a sweater pattern and a yarn. And then my mother would make the sweater for the graduating senior. After my mother died, my cousin Lance wrote me and said, the sweater your mother made me for my high school graduation is probably the only high school graduation present that I still have. It sits on the shelf in my closet. And whenever it's cold and I need to look nice, the handiwork of Aunt Seal warms my body and soul. Now, my mother taught me to knit, and we both found it very comforting to be knitting during stressful situations. So when my mother called to tell me, your father's gone into the hospital, it looks like it's for the last time, I said, do you have something to knit? And she said, no. I said, well, go to a yarn shop, pick up some yarn, make a scarf for somebody, anybody. Just have some knitting with you, because I knew she was going to be sitting in his room waiting a lot. And when I arrived, I brought my knitting too. After my father died, my mother kept on knitting until she herself went into the hospital for an 8-hour cancer operation. When she came out of the operation and was in intensive care and I could see her, she wanted to tell me something. She was very agitated, but she couldn't speak because the breathing tube was still in her. But they had given her a pad and a pencil to write with. Unfortunately, she didn't have her reading glasses, so she wrote me a note that she couldn't read as she was writing it, and therefore it wasn't very clear, and I could only recognize 3 words: died, father, and sweater. I didn't know what to do with the last 2 words, but for the first one I said, no, Mom, you didn't die. The doctors think they got it all, and you'll be feeling much better in a few days. But father and sweater, I just ignored them. Several days later, the breathing tube was out, and we were chatting. And so I asked her, do you remember a couple of days ago you wrote me a note, you wanted to tell me something, but the only words I could recognize were died, father, and sweater. Do you remember what that was about? She said, oh yes. When I was being operated on, I had a dream that your father was waiting for me at the other side of a river. And I thought, oh, classical Greek kind of dream. Wonderful. But then she said, but he was wearing a sweater that I hadn't made, and I wanted to know who had made him that sweater. Now, we're still in intensive care, okay? And she's hooked up to who knows what flowing into her body. So I wasn't sure what the drugs might be doing to her mind. So I said as kindly as I could, you do remember that when Father died, he wasn't able to take any of your sweaters with him? Of course I know that. It was just a dream. So we chatted about this dream for a little bit and came to the conclusion that heaven must have some sort of designated knitters society that makes sweaters for people whose family knitter has yet to arrive. Yes, I remember my mother's hands. I'm reminded of them whenever I see my sister-in-law's hands, because her engagement ring has my mother's round, brilliant cut diamond in it. I'm reminded of my mother's hands whenever I'm playing music from one of her songbooks, or when I'm knitting something for members of our family. And you know, I'm also reminded of her hands when I look at my own, because they are the exact same shape. Even the moons on our fingernails are identical. And I'm beginning to see the veins and bones through the backs of my hands. So it doesn't bother me anymore when I'm remembering what she looks like and I realize that it's actually a photograph that I'm remembering. Because you see, I know I remember my favorite mother.